Hello and welcome to this next episode of Dr. K's Psychobabble. Today we're going to be looking at the theory of James Marcia, Canadian psychologist, who provides us with a model of being able to track how aspects of our identity change over time, very deeply part of the process of developmental psych. So in order to have a good understanding of where Marcia is coming from, Marcia studied Erikson's psychosocial stages extensively, and so he was very interested in the work of Erikson. He questioned, as individuals were moving through these stages, if we took a snapshot at any given point, could there be a model that describes where we're at in terms of our identity in that particular point in time? And so his theory really attempts to do that. So we have James Marcia here, and the premise of James Marcia's theory is that, in terms of how it's being applied in my lecture right now, is that identity is made up of numerous parts. That identity, we might speak of it in terms of just one entity, like who I am, but let's say I was going to ask you to describe who you are. You might, in bullet points, you might have numerous bullet points, having to do with your gender, your job, who you're related to, your different roles in society, what you're good at, and all those things. And each one of those aspects of yourself developed over time. So the application of James Marcia's theory is to look at each one of those pieces of development and say, what's the timeline of what happened in terms of your development of that part of your identity? And there may be parts of your identity that you actually have discarded. Those things are no longer part of who you are. And so how do we transition from having something that's not part of our identity into having it as part of our identity, and then maybe sometimes moving on and it is no longer part of our identity? So another aspect of his theory, and the key one that we're going to be talking today, is that each part can be at a different status. Each one of these, we may have a career identity, we may have a what kind of car do I drive identity, we may have relationship identity, we may have hobbies that are part of our identity, and each one of those can be in a different status at a given point, but each one can only be in one status. And that status is determined by two processes. Now, Marcia uses the words crisis and commitment. I want to be clear that we understand that by crisis, he doesn't mean that an individual is in a bad place. What Marcia means by crisis is that the person at that point in time is actively looking or has actively looked at the different options they have for that part of their identity. When commitment happens, the individual has selected that particular aspect of their identity. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for that when we're looking at a piece of somebody's identity, we're looking at the degree to which they went through crisis and the degree to which they went through commitment. So we're going to look at this from the point of view of a 2x2 graph that helps us understand the different combinations of crisis and commitment. So across the top, we have crisis. Whether the individual, we're looking at a snapshot right now, at this point, is this part of your identity? Did you look at the options? Yes or no. On the other dimension, we have you committed? Yes or no. And you can see that this 2x2 format gives us 4 options, and these cells are what Marcia refers to as his identity statuses. So let's go through those rather quickly here. The first one is achieved identity, and this means that that part of the identity, the individual has looked at the different options and they have selected one. And achieved identity is considered by Marcia to be the ultimate goal of aspects of, particularly core aspects of our identity. Now the other one is foreclosed, which is interesting because you'll see that the person has committed, but they haven't really looked at the options. So this is a person who's engaged in a part of their identity It may have been that they were just from birth, they were expected to do this. You know, the family business, let's say. You grow up in a family that owns a garage, and you're born in that family, and your father put, you know, Frank and daughter right up on the sign as soon as you were born. So you were destined to be a mechanic. And so the person growing up could feel that that is what they're going to do. They could feel committed to it, but they really haven't looked at the other options. The next one is moratorium. And this is the time in which we are actively searching, but we haven't decided yet. But we're engaged in the search. We're looking around. Let's say you're shopping for a car, but you haven't decided on what you're going to do. You're looking at different careers, but you haven't decided what you want to do yet, but you're actively looking. And finally, we have diffused identity. Now, in diffused identity, neither you're not looking and you're not committing. It's sort of, these are aspects of your identity that are on the back burner. So really, really quickly, I'll go through examples of this in terms of my own identity. In terms of achieved identity, I've had all kinds of jobs. I've looked at different jobs. I applied for the job I have right now, and I got it, and I'm sticking with it because I like it. And so I did go through a crisis looking around for jobs, and then I've committed to this one. Aspects of my identity that are foreclosed. The easiest one is for me is my sex, my gender, and the combination of sex and gender that I particularly have. That was given to me way before I was making choices, and I have never really seriously considered looking at other options. Now let's say what about my identity is still in moratorium. Now as I'm doing these videos, to tell you the truth, I'm looking for some additional gear to help me with making these videos more quickly and more easily. So I'm looking on catalogs and whatnot, but I haven't committed yet as to what I want to do, or even if I want to get another piece of gear and spend money that way. And finally, in diffused, I could maybe imagine that my retirement plans, let's say where I'm going to live when I'm retired. I haven't really looked at that. It is something that's going to be part of my identity in the future, but it's not something right now. So let's look at how a single aspect of our identity over time can change as a process of maturation. So we'll take a look at a part. I'll use myself again as an example and my status, and understand that each one of these, when we're taking a snapshot, but we're actually locating that piece of identity in time. So each one of those has a pathway through time. So you can think of a piece of your identity. It moved from cell to cell, and this is an example I'm going to give you. So my first example is my college degrees. And so when I was young, it was diffused. I didn't know what I wanted to do, didn't make any plans, didn't apply for college. I wasn't looking to go into college at that point. So at that point, it was in my future, but it was not going to be something that I'm actively looking at, nor am I making commitments. Around the time that I was a junior, sorry about that, foreclosed. There is a piece of my identity that is actually foreclosed, and that was it was an expectation that I would go to college. My parents were very insistent on that. So that's nothing, it was always going to be part of my plan. So later on, when I was in high school and around junior year, I started looking at colleges and seriously considering my options. I picked a college in New York and applied for it, and when I got accepted, that became an achieved part of my identity. That was the aspect of my identity at that point, was I became a student of Southampton College. Another way we can look at this is through hobbies. Let's say I was into photography at one time, so I'll go back to early on. So early on, when I wasn't into photography, I was young, and then I discovered what photography was, and I said, I think I want to buy a camera. So I went into moratorium at that point. I'm actively looking for a camera. That would be great, and I'm looking at different ones, and finally I picked one. So now I'm an owner of a Canon camera, and that was very cool. And then went to college and whatnot. And to tell you the truth, I kind of fell out of doing photography for a while. So back burner, I wasn't taking pictures anymore, feeling kind of diffused about that. It's really not something I'm doing anymore. I still have the gear, but I'm not using it anymore. And then maybe I'm online and I see some really neat pictures, so I decide maybe I'll get back into that. So I moved back into moratorium. So do I want a new camera? Do I want to go to a digital camera? And all that. So I decide I want to get a digital camera, and I move again into achieved status. And you'll see here how our pieces of our identity over time move from cell to cell. And that is what Marcia was talking about when he talked about status. It's a state, almost like when we talk about emotional states or states of consciousness. This is a status, so it's a moving, dynamic aspects of our identity as we move through the different aspects of identity status based on whether we have crisis or commitment. Now, the general model here is that our entire being is made up of all of these pieces. So here's this image of a person who's made up of jigsaw puzzle pieces. And so you have each one of these pieces is an aspect of their identity that all comes together. It makes the entire who you are. But if we ask this person today, tell me about the different aspects of your identity, they may see that some are foreclosed, some are achieved, some in moratorium. And then if we ask them 3 months later, three years later, these labels would be different. Some of them would be different. They've moved on and they have other aspects of their identity that they're focusing on, or some things have become diffused, or they've achieved certain things. So this is a moving target. And so our identity is fluid. It's made up of all these different parts, and each part can actually have its own status based on Marcia's theory.